White House stands at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, one of the most recognized buildings in the world. The neoclassical facade, the iconic columns, the perfectly manicured grounds. Over 200 years of American history have unfolded within its walls and on its grounds. But before it was painted white, before it housed presidents, before it became a symbol of American democracy, it was a construction site. The building rose slowly from swampy ground along the Potomac River. The work took years. The labor came from multiple sources, both free and enslaved. This is the story of how the White House was built, the political compromises that determined its location, the architectural competition that selected its design, the Irish architect who drew the plans, the craftsmen and laborers, some paid and some enslaved, who turned those plans into stone and timber, the fire that nearly destroyed it, the reconstruction that made it what we recognize today. The building's history is complicated. It was constructed during a period when slavery was legal in much of the United States. Some of the people who built it were enslaved. That reality is part of the story, neither to be ignored nor sensationalized, but understood as historical fact. The White House took shape between 1792 and 1800, with major reconstruction after 1814. Understanding how and why it was built requires understanding the young nation that commissioned it. The compromises, the constraints, the ambitions, all shaped the building that emerged. If you're interested in architectural history and how America's most famous residents came to exist, please consider subscribing. I would also love if you gave a comment if you have additional insights on the story of the White House. Let's begin with the decision that made everything else possible: where to build the nation's new capital. Choosing the site. A capital in a swamp. When the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788, the new federal government had no permanent home. Congress had met in various cities: Philadelphia, New York, Princeton, Annapolis, Trenton, and others had all hosted the itinerant legislature. The question of where to establish a permanent capital became a significant political issue that divided northern and southern states. The Compromise of 1790 resolved the matter through backroom negotiations. Alexander Hamilton needed Southern votes to pass his ambitious financial plan, which included the federal government assuming the substantial debts that individual states had accumulated during the Revolutionary War. Northern states generally supported this assumption because many had larger debts. Southern states, which had largely paid down their war debts, opposed being taxed to pay for Northern obligations. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wanted the capital located in the South rather than remaining in northern cities like Philadelphia or New York. A Southern capital would provide economic benefits to the region and symbolic recognition of Southern importance to the new nation. The existing northern cities had established commercial and political interests that some founders worried would unduly influence the federal government. The compromise was reportedly straightforward. Hamilton got his financial plan passed with the necessary Southern votes. Jefferson and Madison got a Southern capital. The location would be along the Potomac River on land ceded by Maryland and Virginia. The deal was apparently struck over dinner at Jefferson's residence in New York, though the exact details of the negotiation remain somewhat unclear in historical records. President George Washington was given authority to select the specific site within a designated area along the Potomac. This was unusual authority for a president and reflected the trust Congress placed in Washington's judgment. The designated area stretched roughly 80 miles along the river, giving Washington considerable discretion in choosing the exact location. Washington chose a location that included the existing settlements at Georgetown in Maryland and Alexandria in Virginia. Georgetown was already an established tobacco trading port with wharves, warehouses, and a small but functioning commercial district. Alexandria was similarly developed. Including these existing settlements meant the new capital wouldn't be starting entirely from nothing. The area was not ideal by many practical measures. Much of the land was swampy and prone to flooding. The terrain was uneven, with hills and valleys that would complicate construction and street layout. Summers were notoriously hot and humid, creating conditions that many considered unhealthy. Mosquitoes bred in the wetlands, and malaria was a real concern. The Potomac could flood dramatically, threatening any structures built too close to its banks. But the location had political advantages that outweighed practical concerns. The Potomac site placed the capital between north and south. A geographic compromise meant to balance regional interests. Neither northern nor southern states could claim the capital as entirely their own. The location also sat at the navigable head of the Potomac, where ocean-going vessels could reach and where the river's fall line provided potential water power for mills and manufacturing. The location was also near Washington's home at Mount Vernon, approximately 15 miles downstream. Washington knew the area intimately and apparently believed it could be developed successfully, despite the challenging terrain. His familiarity with the region's possibilities may have influenced his selection as much as any political calculation. The Residence Act of 1790 authorized creation of a federal district not exceeding 10 miles square. This would create a diamond-shaped territory under exclusive federal jurisdiction, independent of any state government. The arrangement was intended to prevent any single state from exercising undue influence over the federal government by controlling the territory where it met. Washington selected the specific boundaries, choosing to include Georgetown within the federal district. The boundary lines were surveyed by Andrew Ellicott, with assistance from Benjamin Banneker, a free African-American astronomer and mathematician, whose involvement represented a notable, if limited, example of black participation in the capital's creation. The surveying work established the precise limits of what would become the District of Columbia. The federal district would be carved from land that Maryland and Virginia agreed to cede to the federal government. Maryland contributed approximately 69 square miles on the river's eastern shore. Virginia contributed approximately 31 square miles on the western shore, including Alexandria. This Virginia portion would later be returned to Virginia in 1846, reducing the district to its current size entirely on the Maryland side. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant was hired to design the new city. L'Enfant was a French-born engineer and architect who had served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. He had come to America as a volunteer, been wounded at the Siege of Savannah, and impressed Washington with his artistic and engineering abilities. After the war, he had redesigned Federal Hall in New York for Washington's first inauguration. L'Enfant's plan for the capital was ambitious, grand in scale and European in inspiration. The design featured wide avenues radiating from central points, grand public spaces, and ceremonial areas, and carefully planned sight lines connecting major buildings and monuments. The design drew heavily on European city planning, particularly the gardens and boulevards of Paris and Versailles, adapted to American circumstances and Republican ideals. L'Enfant's plan included positions for a president's house and a Capitol building as the two major structures anchoring the design. The Capitol would sit on Jenkins Hill, which L'Enfant described as a pedestal waiting for a monument. The president's house would occupy elevated ground approximately 1 mile northwest, connected to the Capitol by a grand avenue that would become Pennsylvania Avenue. The president's house location offered both practical advantages and symbolic positioning. The ground was higher than much of the surrounding area, providing better drainage and protection from flooding. The elevation also provided views of the Potomac River and the Virginia countryside beyond. The house would be visible from many points in the city, but positioned at appropriate distance from the Capitol, neither dominating the legislature nor subordinate to it. The actual site selected for the President's house was reportedly chosen by Washington himself during his tours of the Federal District. The ground sloped gently toward the river, requiring some preparation but not extensive terracing. The location placed the house in relation to the Capitol as L'Enfant had envisioned, though the precise positioning reflected Washington's preferences as much as the city planner's original concept. But the site came with challenges. The ground required extensive preparation before construction could begin. Drainage had to be addressed to prevent water problems in any foundation. The terrain needed leveling in some areas and building up in others. The location, while elevated relative to immediate surroundings, was still in a region where summers were uncomfortable at best and winters could be harsh. Building anything substantial would require significant effort and resources in a location with limited existing infrastructure. Roads barely existed. Building materials would need to be transported considerable distances. Skilled workers would need to be recruited from elsewhere and housed during construction. The challenges were substantial, and the young federal government had limited resources and no experience with major construction projects. L'Enfant's temperament proved problematic. He was brilliant but difficult, unwilling to share his plans with the commissioners appointed to oversee the district's development, dismissive of their authority, and prone to making decisions unilaterally. When he ordered the demolition of a house that a prominent landowner had built in the path of a planned street without obtaining proper authorization, his position became untenable. Washington reluctantly dismissed L'Enfant in 1792. The French designer left before completing detailed plans, taking most of his drawings with him. Andrew Ellicott, the surveyor, recreated what he could of L'Enfant's vision from memory, and the work already completed. The basic concept survived, but many details were lost or modified as development proceeded without L'Enfant's direct involvement. The decision to build the Capitol in what was essentially undeveloped land rather than in an established city reflected both idealism and political necessity. The new nation wanted a capital that wasn't dominated by existing commercial or social interests. A purpose-built city could embody Republican principles in its very layout and architecture. It would belong to the nation as a whole, not to any particular state or faction. But building from nothing also meant creating infrastructure where little existed. Roads, bridges, and water systems all had to be constructed. Workers had to be recruited or transported to a location with few amenities. Materials had to be sourced and delivered over poor roads or by water. The challenges were enormous, and the timeline was tight. The government was scheduled to move to the new capital by the first Monday in December, 1800. That gave approximately 10 years to design and construct essential buildings and infrastructure. For a major public building like the President's house, that was an extremely compressed schedule given the available technology and resources. Washington understood the challenges, but remained committed to the Potomac location despite criticism from those who thought the scheme impractical or the site poorly chosen. He worked closely with the 3 commissioners appointed to oversee development of the federal district. He made multiple visits to inspect progress and resolve disputes. The site was chosen. The basic plan was approved. The next step was determining what the President's house would actually look like. The competition. Designing a President's house. In March of 1792, the commissioners overseeing development of the federal district announced an architectural competition for the President's house. The competition was advertised in newspapers throughout the states, inviting architects and other interested parties to submit designs. The winner would receive $500 or a gold medal of equivalent value, a substantial prize for the period. The competition instructions specified certain requirements, while leaving considerable room for interpretation. The house needed to accommodate both the president's private residence and official functions of state. It should be substantial enough to represent the young nation's dignity in dealings with foreign powers, but not so grand as to suggest monarchy or aristocratic pretension inappropriate for a republic. The building should be constructed of brick or stone for permanence and fire resistance. The competition deadline was July 15, 1792, giving interested architects approximately 4 months to prepare and submit designs. This was a short timeline for developing plans for what would be one of the most important buildings in the new nation. The compressed schedule may have limited the number and quality of submissions. The competition instructions left considerable room for interpretation on crucial questions. How large should the house be? The instructions mentioned accommodation for the president and his family, spaces for official entertaining, and offices for conducting government business, but specified no particular dimensions. What architectural style was appropriate for a republic? Classical references might suggest connection to ancient democratic traditions, but could also evoke imperial Rome. How should the building balance private and public functions? These questions fell to the competing architects to answer through their designs. Multiple designs were submitted, though the exact number varies in different historical accounts. Some sources suggest as many as 9 entries, others fewer. Most submissions have not survived or remain unidentified. What's known is that the submitted designs varied considerably in scale, style, and ambition. Some were relatively modest, appropriate perhaps for a prosperous merchant or minor aristocrat. Others proposed palace-like structures that seemed unsuitable for a republic. Thomas Jefferson submitted a design anonymously, signing it only with his initials A.Z. to disguise his identity. Jefferson was deeply interested in architecture, largely self-taught through books and his observations during European travels. He had strong opinions about what buildings should express about the societies that built them. His design for the president's house drew on classical Roman precedents, particularly Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotonda near Vicenza, Italy. Jefferson's proposal featured a central dome over a circular room and relatively restrained classical elements. The design was elegant and scholarly, reflecting Jefferson's admiration for Roman Republican architecture. He believed classical forms appropriate for a republic because they connected the new nation to ancient democratic traditions while avoiding the Baroque elaboration he associated with European monarchy. Jefferson's submission was not selected. The reasons are not entirely clear from surviving historical records. The design may have been considered too modest for the residence of a head of state, who would need to receive foreign ministers and conduct official business. It may have been seen as too obviously derivative of specific European models. Jefferson's identity, despite his attempt at anonymity, may have been known or suspected, complicating evaluation of his entry. Other submitted designs reportedly included proposals for elaborate structures with extensive ornamentation, buildings that would have rivaled European palaces in grandeur and expense. These were apparently rejected as too monarchical in character, too expensive given the government's limited resources, or simply impractical given the construction timeline and available workforce. The winning design came from James Hoban, an Irish-born architect working in Charleston, South Carolina. Hoban's proposal apparently struck the balance the commissioners sought. The design was substantial without being overwhelming. It drew on classical precedents familiar in English and Irish architecture, but adapted them to American circumstances. It could accommodate both private residents and public functions while remaining within likely budgetary constraints. Holbein's design featured a rectangular plan with a main block and flanking wings. The style was Georgian, a restrained neoclassical approach that had dominated British and Irish architecture for much of the 18th century. Georgian buildings emphasized symmetry. Classical proportions derived from Renaissance interpretations of ancient architecture, and relatively simple ornamentation that relied on correct proportion rather than elaborate decoration for its effect. The facade would feature evenly spaced windows, arranged symmetrically around a central entrance. Classical elements, including pilasters, cornices, and a triangular pediment, would provide appropriate dignity without excessive ornament. The design suggested permanence and stability through its solid proportions and use of stone construction. It conveyed dignity appropriate for a head of state without the autocratic grandeur of European palaces. The selection process involved both the commissioners and President Washington himself. Washington's preferences apparently influenced the final choice significantly. He had strong opinions about the capital's development and took active personal interest in the president's house design. He knew what he wanted the building to express about the presidency and the nation. Washington reportedly wanted a larger building than Holbein's original competition entry proposed. The original design, while dignified, may have seemed insufficient for official entertaining and the reception of foreign dignitaries. Washington intervened to have the plans enlarged, increasing both the footprint and the overall scale of the building. These changes made the final structure more impressive, but also more expensive and time-consuming to construct. The competition revealed tensions about what the president's house should represent that would persist throughout its construction and long afterward. Too modest, and it might diminish the nation's dignity in dealings with established European powers. Too grand, and it might suggest the president was becoming a monarch. The very outcome the revolution had been fought to prevent. The selected design attempted to navigate between these concerns, creating a building that was impressive but not overwhelming, permanent but not oppressive, dignified but not royal. The balance was deliberate and reflected careful consideration of what architectural character was appropriate for the leader of a republic. Holbein's winning design would guide construction. The modifications would occur during building and afterward. The basic form, the proportions, the general character, all came from the competition entry as modified by Washington's enlargements. The selection determined what would rise on the prepared site along the Potomac, and established precedents for American public architecture that would influence countless later buildings. James Holbein, the Irish architect's vision. James Holbein was born in County Kilkenny, Ireland, around 1755 or 1758. The exact year is uncertain, as parish records from that period in rural Ireland are incomplete. He grew up in a region known for its limestone buildings and long tradition of masonry work. His early exposure to building and construction apparently sparked an interest that would define his career. Holbein received formal architectural training at the Dublin Society's drawing schools, an institution established to promote practical arts and improve Irish manufacturing and building. The school provided instruction in drawing, design, and the principles of classical architecture. Students learned to work from pattern books and to understand the proportional systems underlying Georgian design. The training was practical, intended to produce competent architects and builders rather than theoretical designers. Dublin in the late 18th century was experiencing significant architectural development. The Georgian squares and terraces that still define much of the city centre were under construction. New public buildings were rising, including the Parliament House and the Custom House. Holbein's training exposed him to this building activity and to the restrained Georgian style that dominated Irish and British architecture during that period. After completing his training, Holbein apparently worked on several buildings in Ireland, though specific commissions from this period are difficult to verify. He may have worked under James Gandon, the English architect who designed some of Dublin's most notable Georgian buildings. This early experience would have provided practical knowledge of large-scale construction to complement his theoretical training. Holbein emigrated to America after the Revolutionary War, arriving sometime around 1785 or 1786. The exact date and his reasons for leaving Ireland are not well documented. Many Irish sought opportunities in America during this period, and the building boom in the former colonies offered work for skilled architects and craftsmen. Holbein may also have sought greater professional independence than was available in Dublin's more established architectural community. Holbein settled first in Philadelphia, then the largest city in America and a center of construction activity. He apparently worked there briefly before moving to Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was a prosperous port city with wealthy merchants and planters who commissioned substantial homes and public buildings. The warm climate may have appealed to an Irishman, and the architectural opportunities were significant. Holbein established himself as an architect and builder, designing and constructing houses for wealthy clients. His work demonstrated competence in the Georgian style he had learned in Dublin, adapted to the climate and materials of the Carolina Low Country. He won commissions for several notable buildings, including the Charleston County Courthouse, demonstrating his capability for public as well as domestic architecture. Holbein's Charleston experience gave him practical knowledge of construction in American conditions, working with local materials and available labor. He learned to manage construction projects from initial design through final completion. This practical experience would prove valuable when he undertook the President's House, which required not just architectural design, but hands-on supervision of a complex construction project far from established supply networks. When the competition for the President's House was announced, Holbein was reportedly in Philadelphia on business. He learned of the competition and decided to enter. His experience and training made him well qualified. He understood classical proportions and Georgian design conventions. He could execute designs in stone or brick construction. He had actually built substantial structures rather than just drawing theoretical plans. Holbein traveled to meet with President Washington, apparently making a favorable impression. Washington appreciated practical competence and may have valued Holbein's experience as a builder as much as his abilities as a designer. The meeting gave Holbein insight into what the president wanted, allowing him to tailor his competition entry accordingly. Holbein's winning design drew inspiration from Leinster House in Dublin. Leinster House, built in the 1740s, was the residence of the Duke of Leinster, one of the most prominent Irish aristocrats. The building featured a rectangular plan, a Georgian facade with symmetrical window arrangement, and classical proportions that conveyed dignity without excessive ostentation. Holbein had certainly seen Leinster House during his Dublin training, and may have worked on buildings nearby. Holbein adapted rather than copied, modifying Leinster House's design for American circumstances and Republican purposes. The modifications were significant. The American building would be constructed of different materials suitable to the new location. The interior arrangement would accommodate the specific functions of a presidential residence rather than an aristocratic home. The symbolism would be Republican rather than aristocratic, though the architectural vocabulary remained similar. The design as submitted featured 3 stories visible from the exterior. The ground floor, partially below grade on the garden side, would contain service and utility spaces, including kitchens, storage rooms, and work areas. The main floor, called the State Floor, would contain the principal public rooms for entertaining and official functions. The upper floor would provide private quarters for the president's family. This vertical arrangement separated public and private functions while keeping everything under one roof. The arrangement was practical, allowing the household to function efficiently while maintaining appropriate separation between service activities and formal spaces. The design also allowed impressive ceiling heights on the main floor, where the most important rooms would be located. The facade as designed followed Georgian principles consistently. The symmetrical window arrangement created visual order and calm. The central entrance with classical portico provided a dignified point of arrival. Restrained ornamentation focusing on correct proportion rather than elaborate decoration achieved grandeur through understatement. The approach suited both available resources and Republican principles. After winning the competition, Hoban became superintendent of construction for the President's House. This role gave him substantial authority over the entire building process, from preparing the site through final finishing work. He would not merely design the building, but oversee every aspect of its construction, ensuring his vision was properly executed. The role also gave Hoban ongoing income and employment security during the years of construction. He would receive regular payment for his supervisory work, in addition to his competition prize. This arrangement was standard for the period, when architects typically maintained close involvement with construction, rather than simply delivering drawings and walking away. Hoban's relationship with President Washington reportedly shaped some aspects of the design during construction. Washington wanted the building larger than Hoban's original competition entry proposed. Hoban modified his plans accordingly, increasing the overall dimensions by roughly 30%, while maintaining the basic design principles. The changes made the building more impressive, but also more expensive and time-consuming to construct. These enlargements had practical consequences. The building required more materials, more labor, and more time to complete. The increased size strained the already tight budget and schedule. But Washington apparently considered the larger scale necessary for the building to adequately represent the nation. His views prevailed, and Hoban adjusted his plans accordingly. The architectural choices Hoban made would influence American public buildings for generations. The Georgian style, the classical proportions, the emphasis on symmetry and restrained ornament all became standard for government architecture. Federal buildings throughout the 19th century followed patterns Hoban established, creating a distinctive American governmental aesthetic rooted in Georgian precedent. Hoban's work on the President's House would occupy years of his life. The construction would proceed slowly, facing numerous challenges from weather, labor shortages, material supply problems, and budget constraints. But Hoban's vision, his design principles, and his practical execution would determine what emerged from the challenging site along the Potomac. Breaking ground, the foundation and early construction. Construction of the President's House officially began on October 13, 1792. The cornerstone was laid in a ceremony that marked the start of major building operations. The date was deliberately chosen, occurring on the 300th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, linking the new building to themes of discovery and new beginnings. The cornerstone ceremony was reportedly modest in scale. President Washington was likely present, though some historical accounts are uncertain about his attendance. Commissioners overseeing the federal district development attended, along with local officials and members of the Masonic Lodge, who conducted traditional rituals associated with cornerstone laying. The cornerstone itself was inscribed and placed, marking the official beginning of construction. The exact location of that original cornerstone has been lost to history. Later attempts to locate it during various renovations have been unsuccessful. The stone was presumably placed somewhere in the foundation, following traditional practice, but no record survives identifying its precise position. The cornerstone likely remains somewhere in the building's lower structure, unidentified among the thousands of other stones. Before the cornerstone ceremony could occur, substantial site preparation was necessary. The ground needed leveling in some areas and building up in others to create a level platform for the foundation. Drainage channels had to be dug to direct water away from where the foundation would sit. Trees and vegetation had to be cleared from the building site and surrounding areas where materials would be stored and workers would operate. This preparatory work was labor-intensive and time-consuming. Much of it required manual labor with basic tools. Picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows moved earth. Axes and saws cleared timber. The work proceeded through the summer of 1792 before the cornerstone ceremony could be scheduled for October. Even after construction officially began, site preparation continued in areas adjacent to active building operations. The foundation was constructed from local stone, different from the sandstone that would be used for exterior walls. Foundation stone didn't need to be attractive, only strong and durable. The foundation walls were thick, designed to support the substantial weight of the building above, and to resist settling in the challenging soil conditions. The foundation extended deep enough to reach stable ground below the surface layers. Foundation work was critical and could not be rushed. Poor foundation work could compromise the entire structure, leading to cracking walls, uneven floors, and potentially catastrophic structural failure. Hoban supervised the foundation construction carefully, ensuring the work met proper standards. The masons laying foundation stone worked methodically, building up courses of stone bonded with mortar to create solid walls. The foundation work took many months to complete. The building's rectangular footprint required foundation walls along the entire perimeter, plus interior foundation walls to support load-bearing partitions above. The work proceeded through autumn and winter, though cold weather slowed progress and sometimes halted operations entirely when temperatures dropped too low for mortar to set properly. Stone for the exterior walls came from quarries at Aquia Creek in Virginia, approximately 40 miles downstream from the building site. The Aquia Creek sandstone was chosen for several reasons. It was available in sufficient quantity for such a large building. It was relatively soft when first quarried, making it easier to cut and carve, but hardened somewhat with exposure to air. The stone had a warm, slightly tan color that would give the building a dignified appearance. Transporting stone from the quarries to the building site involved significant logistics. The stone was heavy, and moving it over the poor roads of the period was slow and expensive. Water transport was more efficient whenever possible. Stone blocks were loaded onto barges at the quarries and floated down Aquia Creek to the Potomac River, then upstream to wharves near the construction site. From the river wharves, the stone had to be moved overland to the building site. This required wagons and teams of horses or oxen. The roads were often poor, particularly in wet weather when they became muddy and nearly impassable. Moving heavy stone blocks on unpaved roads was slow, difficult work that wore out animals and damaged wagons. Each block had to be loaded at the wharf, transported carefully to avoid damage, and unloaded at the construction site. The stone arrived at the site as rough blocks, larger and heavier than their final dimensions. Initial rough shaping sometimes occurred at the quarry to reduce weight for transportation, but finish work happened at the building site. Stone cutters shaped each block to precise dimensions, creating smooth outer surfaces for the facade and precise edges to allow blocks to fit tightly together. This stone cutting required skill developed through years of apprenticeship and practice. The cutters worked with hammers, chisels, and other hand tools, gradually removing excess stone to achieve specified dimensions. The work was dusty, physically demanding, and time-consuming. Each block for the facade required careful attention to achieve the smooth surface and precise fit necessary for a quality finished building. The workforce that assembled for construction was diverse in skills, backgrounds, and legal status. Skilled craftsmen formed the essential core. Stonecutters who shaped the sandstone blocks, masons who laid the stone and worked with mortar, carpenters who would frame interior spaces, build scaffolding, and construct the roof. Each trade required years of training and represented specialized knowledge essential to the project. Many skilled craftsmen were immigrants, particularly from Britain and Ireland. They brought European training and experience to the American project. These workers generally received regular wages paid weekly or monthly. They could theoretically leave the project if they chose, though finding alternative employment in the undeveloped federal district was difficult. Most stayed for the duration of their contracts or until the work was complete. But skilled free labor was insufficient for the scale of work required. The project also employed laborers for less skilled tasks, digging foundations and drainage channels, hauling stone from the wharves to the building site, mixing mortar from lime, sand, and water, moving materials around the site as needed, clearing debris. This work required strength and endurance, but not specialized training. Some of these laborers were free workers, paid daily or weekly wages for their labor. Others were enslaved workers, hired from their owners or owned by contractors working on the building. The use of enslaved labor on the President's house was documented in contemporary records and has been confirmed by subsequent historical research. The workforce: free and enslaved builders. The construction of the President's house required a large workforce sustained over many years. Understanding who built the building means examining both the free craftsmen who worked for wages and the enslaved individuals who labored under compulsion. The historical record preserves information about both groups. Though documentation is more complete for free workers than for enslaved ones, skilled craftsmen formed the construction workforce's essential core. Without their specialized knowledge and abilities, the building could not have been constructed to proper standards. Stonecutters shaped the Aquia Creek sandstone into precise blocks with smooth surfaces and exact dimensions. Masons laid the stone, checking alignment constantly with levels and plumb lines, ensuring walls rose straight and true. Carpenters framed interior spaces, built floors, and would eventually construct the roof structure. Plasterers would finish interior walls when construction progressed to that stage. Each craft required years of training and experience. The commissioners responsible for the federal district's development recruited skilled workers actively. Advertisements appeared in newspapers in American cities and even abroad. Craftsmen were promised regular wages and steady employment on an important national project. Some workers came from Philadelphia, then America's largest city, with an established building trades community. Others came from more distant locations, attracted by the promise of work. Many skilled craftsmen were immigrants from Britain and Ireland, who brought European training to the American project. Scottish stone cutters were particularly valued for their skill in working stone. Irish craftsmen brought experience from Dublin's building boom. English workers contributed knowledge of Georgian construction methods. The building rose as an immigrant project in many ways, constructed by workers who had crossed the Atlantic seeking opportunity. Surviving payroll records document payments to named individuals for specific work periods. The records show that skilled craftsmen received substantially higher wages than unskilled laborers, reflecting their years of training and the essential nature of their work. A master mason might earn several times what a common laborer received. These wage differences created hierarchies within the workforce based on skill and training. But paying wages sufficient to attract enough free workers proved challenging. The federal district was isolated, with few amenities and limited housing. The climate was uncomfortable much of the year. Alternative employment opportunities in the undeveloped capital area were scarce, but so were the attractions that might make workers willing to accept lower wages. The commissioners struggled to recruit and retain sufficient skilled labor throughout the construction period. The solution, in part, was enslaved labor. The federal district was carved from Maryland and Virginia, both slave states where slavery was legal and common. Enslaved people constituted a significant portion of the regional workforce. The commissioners organizing construction worked within the labor systems available to them, and those systems included slavery. The federal government hired enslaved workers from their owners for specified periods. The hiring arrangements were straightforward business transactions. Slave owners contracted with the government commissioners to provide laborers. The government paid the owners daily or weekly rates for their enslaved workers' time. The payments went entirely to the owners, not to the enslaved individuals actually doing the work. The owners typically remained responsible for providing food, shelter, and clothing for their enslaved workers during the hire period. Some hired out enslaved workers lived on their owners' properties and traveled to the construction site daily. Others were housed near the building site in temporary quarters. The arrangements varied depending on distance, the owner's preferences, and the nature of the work being performed. Payroll records preserved at the National Archives document these hiring arrangements in detail. The records list payments to slave owners by name, specifying how many enslaved workers were provided and for what periods. But the records generally don't provide are the names of the enslaved individuals, actually, performing the work. The workers appear in official documents primarily as numbers in payment ledgers, identified by their owners rather than by their own names. Some names of enslaved workers have been recovered through careful historical research. Records occasionally mention individuals by first name when documenting specific tasks or incidents. Cross-referencing various documents, including estate records, church registers, and other sources, has allowed historians to identify some of the enslaved people who worked on the president's house. But many remain anonymous in the historical record, their individual identities lost. The work performed by enslaved laborers covered a range of tasks. Much of it was unskilled labor requiring strength and endurance, but not specialized training. Digging foundations and drainage trenches, hauling stone from the wharves to the building site, loading and unloading wagons, mixing mortar, clearing debris, moving materials around the site as construction progressed. This essential work kept the project moving, but left few traces identifying who performed it. Some enslaved workers possessed specialized skills that made them valuable beyond basic physical labor. Enslaved carpenters, masons, and blacksmiths worked on the president's house alongside free craftsmen. These skilled enslaved workers had learned their trades through formal or informal apprenticeship, sometimes training under free craftsmen, sometimes learning from other enslaved workers. The distinction between free and enslaved skilled workers was legal status, not necessarily skill level. An enslaved carpenter might be as capable as a free one, using the same techniques and producing work of equal quality. But the enslaved worker's labor benefited his owner rather than himself. The wages for his work went to his owner. His continued employment depended on his owner's decisions. His life remained fundamentally constrained by bondage, regardless of his abilities. Working conditions on the construction site were demanding for all laborers, regardless of status. The work was physical and often dangerous. Heavy stone blocks could slip during lifting, crushing workers beneath them. Scaffolding could collapse. Tools could cause injuries. Safety provisions were minimal by modern standards, and accidents certainly occurred. though detailed records of injuries are scarce. Weather exposure was constant. The site offered little shelter from sun, rain, or cold. Workers labored through hot, humid Washington summers that sapped energy and encouraged illness. They worked through cold winters when stone and mortar froze and progress slowed. The physical demands were substantial for everyone on the site. Free workers could theoretically leave if conditions became intolerable, though economic necessity often kept them on the job despite hardships. Enslaved workers had no such option. They remained on the job as long as their owners chose to hire them out, regardless of conditions, regardless of their wishes. The fundamental distinction between free and enslaved labor pervaded the construction site even when workers performed identical tasks. The commissioner's records document that enslaved laborers worked on the president's house from the early construction period through completion. They were present during the foundation work, during the raising of walls, during the finishing operations. The building rose with their labor, as well as that of free workers. The presidential residence was constructed in part by people who themselves were denied the freedom that residence would come to symbolize. Modern understanding of this history is complicated. The White House is a powerful symbol of American democracy and freedom. The fact that enslaved people helped build it creates uncomfortable tension between symbol and reality. The building represents ideals that its very construction contradicted. This contradiction is historical fact, neither to be ignored nor overstated, but recognized as part of the complex reality of how the United States developed. Building the walls. Stone, labor, and progress. The exterior walls of the President's house rose slowly between 1793 and 1798. The process required careful coordination of quarrying, transportation, stone cutting, and masonry. Each stage involved substantial labor and presented its own challenges. Progress was steady, but frustratingly slow, given the tight deadline for completing the building. At the Aquia Creek quarries in Virginia, workers extracted sandstone blocks from the earth. Quarrying required knowledge of stone formation and proper extraction techniques. Workers studied the stone beds to identify natural fracture lines where blocks could be split most easily. They drilled holes along these lines, inserted iron wedges, and drove the wedges with heavy hammers until the stone split along the intended line. The work was skilled, physical, and dangerous. The quarried blocks were rough and oversized when extracted, larger than their final dimensions would be. Initial shaping often occurred at the quarry site to reduce weight for transportation. Workers removed obviously excess material with picks and chisels, creating blocks that were approximately the right size but still required finishing. This preliminary work made the blocks somewhat lighter and easier to handle during the difficult journey to the building site. Transportation from quarry to building site involved multiple stages and many hands. Workers loaded stone blocks onto carts or sleds at the quarry. Draft animals hauled the stone to the creek bank. Workers loaded the blocks onto flat-bottomed barges, taking care to distribute weight evenly to avoid capsizing. The barges floated down Aquia Creek to the Potomac River, then upstream toward the Federal District. Water transport was efficient for heavy materials, but not without challenges. The barges moved slowly, dependent on current, wind, and the efforts of the bargemen. Unloading at the wharves near the building site required careful handling to prevent damage to blocks that had already survived quarrying and loading. Each block represented substantial investment of labor, and damage at any stage meant wasted effort. From the river wharves, the stone traveled overland to the construction site. This final leg of the journey was often the most difficult. Wagons drawn by horses or oxen carried the heavy blocks over roads that were poor in good weather and nearly impassable when wet. The wagons were designed for heavy loads, but still broke down regularly under the strain. The roads themselves suffered, rutted and damaged by the constant heavy traffic. At the building site, stone cutters finished the blocks to precise specifications. Each block destined for the exterior facade needed smooth outer surfaces that would present a finished appearance. The edges required precise cutting to fit tightly against adjacent blocks. The backs of the blocks, invisible once installed, could be left rougher, but still had to fit within the wall structure. The stone cutters worked primarily with hand tools. Hammers and chisels of various sizes allowed them to remove stone in controlled amounts. Point chisels made initial rough cuts. Claw chisels created intermediate surfaces. Flat chisels produced the final smooth finish. The work required patience, skill, and physical endurance. Each block took hours of careful labor to finish properly. The finished blocks were then lifted into position on the rising walls. For the lower courses, lifting was manageable with basic equipment and muscle power. Workers used ropes, levers, and rollers to maneuver the heavy blocks into position. As the walls rose higher, more elaborate equipment became necessary. Wooden scaffolding provided platforms for workers at height and support for lifting equipment. The scaffolding was built progressively, rising as the walls rose. Workers had to trust their lives to these wooden structures, which were subject to weathering, load stress, and the limitations of period construction methods. Scaffolding failures occurred on construction sites of the era, though records of specific accidents at the President's house are limited. Simple cranes and hoisting devices lifted stone blocks to upper levels. These devices used ropes, pulleys, and human or animal power to raise heavy loads. Multiple workers coordinated to operate the hoisting equipment, raise each block smoothly, position it precisely, and lower it into place. The work was slow and required constant attention. A block dropped or positioned incorrectly could damage other work or injure workers below. Masons worked with the positioned blocks, setting them permanently with mortar. The mortar, made from lime, sand, and water, had to be mixed to proper consistency and applied correctly. Too thin and it wouldn't provide adequate bonding between blocks. Too thick and it was difficult to work and might not cure properly. The masons checked alignment constantly using levels and plumb lines to ensure the walls rose straight. The wall construction proceeded in sections rather than attempting to raise the entire perimeter simultaneously. Work focused on building one section to a certain height before moving to adjacent sections. This approach allowed more efficient use of scaffolding and equipment. It also distributed the building's weight more evenly, reducing risk of settling or structural problems during construction. Interior walls rose alongside exterior walls. The interior walls were generally brick rather than stone. Brick was less expensive, faster to lay, and adequate for interior walls that wouldn't bear the same loads or weather exposure as exterior walls. Bricklayers worked simultaneously with the stonemasons, creating the interior structure that would divide the building into rooms. Progress varied significantly with weather conditions. Rain could halt outdoor work entirely, particularly mortar work that required dry conditions to cure properly. Winter brought its own challenges. Mortar could freeze before setting if temperatures dropped too low. Stone became more difficult to work in cold weather. The short daylight hours of winter limited productive work time. The construction site operated year-round, but productivity dropped substantially during unfavorable seasons. The workforce composition remained diverse throughout the wall construction period. Free craftsmen, particularly the skilled stonecutters and masons, performed the most specialized work. Enslaved laborers provided much of the muscle power for moving materials operating hoisting equipment, and assisting skilled workers. The mixture of free and enslaved labor that characterized the project's beginning continued through the years of wall construction. By 1795, walls had reached full height in some sections, but construction remained far from complete. By 1796, the basic exterior structure was taking recognizable form. Visitors to the site could see the building's intended shape and scale emerging from the scaffolding and construction materials. But the exterior walls were only part of the work. The roof, the interior floors and partitions, and all the finishing work remained ahead. The sandstone itself required ongoing attention even during construction. Aquia Creek sandstone was relatively soft and susceptible to weathering. Exposed surfaces could deteriorate if left unprotected too long before the building was completed. Workers sometimes had to repair or replace stones that had weathered or been damaged during the extended construction period. This added unexpected work and expense to an already demanding project. By 1798, the exterior walls stood essentially complete. The building's footprint was established. Its mass and proportions were visible. The structure was recognizable as the design Hobart had created and Washington had approved. But years of additional work remained before the President's house would be ready for occupancy. The tight deadline of 1800 loomed, and the building was far from finished. The enslaved craftsmen, skills in contributions. Among the enslaved workers who labored on the President's house, some possessed specialized skills that made their contributions essential to the building's construction. These craftsmen worked in trades that required years of training: carpentry, masonry, stone cutting, blacksmithing. Their work was as skilled as that of free craftsmen, though their stories are harder to recover from historical records. Carpentry was one of the most common skilled trades among enslaved workers in the late 18th century. An enslaved person who learned carpentry became more valuable to their owner, who could hire them out at higher rates than unskilled laborers commanded. The skills also provided some degree of daily autonomy, as skilled craftsmen often worked with less direct supervision than those performing unskilled labor. Enslaved carpenters on the President's house worked on various aspects of construction. Interior framing required skilled carpentry to create the wooden structures that would support floors and define rooms. Roof construction demanded understanding of complex timber framing techniques. Staircases combined structural engineering with fine finish work. Window and door frames required precise measurements and careful execution. This carpentry work required understanding of structural principles and ability to read plans or receive and execute complex verbal instructions. The work demanded skill with hand tools, including saws, planes, chisels, and hammers. An enslaved carpenter performed work identical in nature to that of free carpenters. The difference was legal status and compensation, not capability or quality of work. Some enslaved workers functioned as stonemasons or worked closely with master masons on the construction. Masonry required specialized knowledge about working with stone and mortar, understanding which way to orient stones for greatest strength, knowing how to mix and apply mortar for proper bonding, maintaining consistent alignment as walls rose, course by course. These skills developed through experience and instruction. Blacksmithing provided another skilled trade where enslaved workers contributed. Construction projects required substantial ironwork, hardware for doors and windows, nails in enormous quantities before machine-made nails became common, tools that wore out or broke and needed repair or replacement, decorative ironwork for gates and railings. Enslaved blacksmiths performed this essential work, maintaining the flow of iron goods necessary for construction. The historical record has preserved some names of enslaved individuals who worked on the president's house, though documentation remains frustratingly incomplete. Commissary records and payroll documents list payments to slave owners, but rarely name the enslaved workers themselves. The workers appear as property of named owners rather than as individuals in their own right. The commissioner's records reference payments to owners for Negro hire. The amounts and durations are specified, but the enslaved individuals remain largely anonymous. When names do appear, they are typically first names only, without the surnames that would help trace individuals through other historical records. This documentation reflected the legal reality that enslaved people were classified as property rather than as persons with full legal standing. Careful historical research has recovered some names and specific contributions. Philip Joyner worked as a carpenter. Tom and Peter worked as sawyers, cutting timber to specified dimensions. Gerard worked as a mason's assistant. These names, and others recovered through archival research, represent individuals whose skilled labor helped construct the president's house. Each recovered name restores some measure of individual identity to people the historical record largely rendered anonymous. The working conditions for enslaved craftsmen differed somewhat from those of unskilled enslaved laborers. Both groups remained in bondage, without freedom of movement or choice about their labor. But skilled enslaved workers sometimes received slightly better treatment because their specialized abilities made them more economically valuable to their owners. An owner who hired out a skilled enslaved carpenter had economic incentive to keep that worker healthy and capable. An injury or illness to a skilled worker represented greater financial loss than similar problems with unskilled laborers. This created some incentive for better treatment, though the motivation was economic rather than humanitarian. Better conditions, when they existed, resulted from calculations of property value rather than recognition of human dignity. Some enslaved craftsmen worked with considerable independence on specific tasks. A skilled carpenter or mason who knew his trade might receive assignments and complete them with minimal direct supervision. This relative autonomy was limited and could be revoked at any time at an owner's whim. But it represented a small measure of control over daily work that unskilled laborers generally lacked. The relationship between free and enslaved craftsmen on the work site was complex. They performed similar tasks and needed to coordinate their efforts. A free mason and an enslaved mason working on the same section of wall had to communicate about materials, timing, and techniques. Professional cooperation was necessary regardless of the profound legal and social inequality between them. Some free craftsmen employed on the project owned enslaved workers themselves. A free carpenter might work alongside enslaved carpenters. He owned all contributing labor to the same construction project. A contractor might bring his enslaved workers to the site as part of fulfilling his contract. These arrangements were unremarkable in the period and region, but add complexity to understanding workforce dynamics. The skills enslaved craftsmen possessed offered limited paths to freedom despite their value. A highly skilled enslaved person might dream of purchasing freedom, but accumulating the necessary funds was extraordinarily difficult. Enslaved workers generally had no legal right to wages, though some owners allowed small payments or permitted limited outside work. Even skilled workers who somehow accumulated money faced enormous obstacles. Purchase prices reflected workers' economic value, meaning the most skilled workers commanded the highest prices for their freedom. An enslaved craftsman's very capabilities made self-purchase more expensive and therefore less achievable. Most skilled enslaved workers remained in bondage regardless of their abilities and contributions. The training enslaved people received in skilled trades followed various patterns. Some learned through formal apprenticeship-like arrangements. though the terms differed fundamentally from traditional apprenticeships for free workers. An enslaved youth might be assigned to learn carpentry or masonry from an older skilled worker, either enslaved or free. The training increased the young person's economic value to their owner without changing their enslaved status. The contributions of enslaved craftsmen to the president's house were substantial. Their skills, their knowledge, and their labor went directly into the building's construction. The carpentry work, the masonry, the ironwork, the countless construction tasks they performed were essential to completing the building on any timeline approaching the deadline. Without their contributions, the project would have taken longer, cost more, and possibly failed entirely, given available free labor. Inside the design, rooms, and layout. James Hoban's design for the President's House created a building with distinct public and private spaces arranged across 3 main floors. The layout reflected both functional needs and symbolic purposes. The house had to accommodate the President's family life, while also serving as a venue for official entertaining and government business. Balancing these different functions within a single building required careful planning. The ground floor sat partially below grade on the garden side of the building. This level contained service and utility spaces necessary for operating a large household. Kitchens occupied substantial space, as cooking for official entertainments required considerable capacity. Storage rooms held food, wine, and household supplies. Work areas provided space for servants to perform tasks supporting the household's operation. This arrangement kept service functions out of sight while maintaining accessibility. Servants could move through the ground floor and reach upper rooms through back stairs without being prominently visible in public spaces. The separation reflected social conventions of the period, which expected domestic operations to proceed efficiently but invisibly. The design allowed the household to function while presenting a dignified public face. The main floor, also called the state floor, contained the principal public rooms. Visitors entering through the main entrance found themselves in a large entrance hall that ran through the building's center. This hall functioned as both circulation space and impressive reception area. Its width and height set the tone for the public rooms opening from it. The East Room occupied a large space at the building's east end. Hoban designed this as the largest room in the house, intended for receptions, public gatherings, and large-scale official entertainments. The dimensions allowed it to accommodate substantial numbers of guests for events like state dinners, diplomatic receptions, and public levees where citizens could meet the president. Adjacent to the East Room, smaller rooms would eventually become the Green Room, Blue Room, and Red Room, though these names came later. These parlors served more intimate gatherings, smaller receptions, and as staging areas for events in the larger East Room. The rooms connected to each other through doorways, allowing guests to move between spaces during entertainments. The Blue Room, centrally positioned on the south side of the building, featured an oval shape that distinguished it from the rectangular rooms elsewhere on the floor. The curved walls created an elegant space that would become one of the house's most distinctive rooms. The design demonstrated Hoban's ability to create variety within his overall classical framework. The state dining room occupied the floor's west end, balancing the East Room on the opposite side. This room was designed for formal dinners, its dimensions calculated to accommodate a large table surrounded by guests. Official dinners served diplomatic and political purposes, making the state dining room an important venue for presidential hospitality. Between these major rooms, Hoban incorporated smaller spaces for various purposes. Some functioned as offices or workspaces where the president could conduct business. Others served as private meeting rooms for confidential conversations. The layout provided flexibility while maintaining clear distinction between public and private functions. The second floor was intended primarily as private family quarters, bedrooms for the President and First Lady, additional bedrooms for children or guests, and sitting rooms for family use occupied this level. The separation between the public main floor and private second floor was important both functionally and symbolically. The President's family needed space away from the constant official activity of the lower floor. The make second floor layout allowed various arrangements depending on the needs of different first families. Larger bedrooms could accommodate couples or be divided for individual family members. Smaller rooms could serve children, guests, or personal servants. Sitting rooms provided space where the family could gather privately. The flexibility allowed different presidents to adapt the space to their circumstances. The third floor, at attic level, provided additional space for bedrooms and storage. These rooms had lower ceilings than floors below and simpler finishes. The spaces served various purposes over time, depending on household needs. Staff quarters, additional guest rooms, storage for items not in regular use. The less formal character marked these as secondary spaces compared to the grand rooms below. Interior architectural details reflected Georgian design principles throughout. The emphasis on symmetry meant that door and window placements followed regular patterns. Classical proportions governed room dimensions and ceiling heights. Decorative elements, including moldings, mantels, and door surrounds, followed classical precedents adapted to the building's specific scale. Fireplaces were essential for heating and appeared in most rooms. The chimneys required careful integration into the design, rising through the building to vent above the roof. Each major room typically had at least one fireplace, positioned prominently as both functional necessity and decorative feature. The mantels surrounding the fireplaces were designed as significant architectural elements, often the most elaborately decorated features in their rooms. Windows provided light and ventilation throughout the building. The Georgian style favored regularly spaced windows in symmetrical arrangements. Window placement balanced practical needs for light with structural requirements and aesthetic considerations. The windows on the main floor were taller than those on upper floors, emphasizing the principal floor's importance through this common classical convention. The interior structure used timber framing standard for the period. Wooden floor joists spanned between walls to support floor surfaces. Wooden beams carried loads. The roof structure used timber framing techniques to create the slopes and support the covering. This wooden structure would eventually become a critical vulnerability when the building burned in 1814. But during construction, it represented practical and economical building technique. Interior walls between major rooms were substantial, providing both structural support and acoustic separation. The walls were typically brick construction or thick plaster over wooden lath. This provided some sound dampening between spaces, important when different activities might occur simultaneously in adjacent rooms. The interior finishing work would take years to complete. Plaster walls required multiple coats applied over lath and allowed to dry between applications. Woodwork including door frames, window casings, baseboards, and decorative moldings required skilled carpentry. Paint and decorative finishes added final layers of completion. Even after the building was structurally complete, finishing work continued for years. John Adams moves in. An unfinished house. In November 1800, President John Adams became the first president to occupy the President's house. The building was far from complete. Construction had been ongoing for 8 years, but extensive finishing work remained. Adams and his wife Abigail moved into what was essentially an active construction site that happened to have a roof. Adams arrived in the new capital city in late October or early November of 1800. The federal government was making its required move from Philadelphia to Washington, as specified in the Residence Act. Congress would convene in the incomplete Capitol building. The president would occupy the incomplete President's House. The timing was driven by legislative schedule rather than by construction readiness. The exterior of the President's House was largely complete when Adams arrived. The stone walls stood. The roof was on and weather-tight. Windows and doors were installed in their openings. From outside, the building presented the substantial, dignified appearance Hoban had designed. The grand structure rose impressively from its site, looking much as its architect had envisioned. But this exterior completion masked the unfinished state of much of the interior. Many rooms lacked plaster on the walls, showing bare brick or lath. Some rooms had no floors completed. The Grand East Room was completely unfinished, an enormous empty shell with no plaster, no paint, no flooring. Windows were in place, but the room remained unusable for any intended purpose. Abigail Adams arrived shortly after her husband and found conditions challenging. Her letters to family members, preserved in historical archives, provide detailed accounts of the house's condition during that first winter. She wrote of the cold, the draughts, the unfinished rooms, the lack of adequate furniture. Her tone was often critical, though she understood she was a pioneer dealing with unprecedented circumstances. The unfinished East Room presented a particular problem. The space was too large and incomplete for any intended use. But Abigail found a practical solution. She used the enormous unfinished room to hang laundry to dry. The image of the First Lady using the grandest room in the President's House as a drying room has become one of the most memorable details of early White House history. Heating was a significant challenge. The house was enormous, with high ceilings and many windows that admitted cold draughts. Many fireplaces were not yet functional because chimneys were incomplete or had construction defects. The few working fireplaces struggled to heat even the rooms where they were located. The rest of the house remained cold and uncomfortable. Abigail Adams wrote that she kept fires burning constantly in the rooms the family occupied, but could barely maintain tolerable temperatures. The expense of firewood was substantial. The drafts through unfinished sections of the building seemed to pull warm air away as quickly as fires could produce it. The family occupied only a fraction of the building's space, leaving the rest cold and largely unused. Furniture was scarce. The federal government had limited budget for furnishing the President's House. Some furniture was transported from Philadelphia, moved from the President's residence there to the new location. But the quantity was insufficient for the many rooms. Some rooms stood completely empty. Others had minimal furnishing inadequate for comfortable use or appropriate entertaining. The grounds around the house were undeveloped and cluttered with construction debris. Materials, equipment, and work areas remained visible around the property. The grand landscape Hoban had envisioned existed only as potential. The immediate environment was muddy when wet, dusty when dry. Roads approaching the house were poor. The setting fell far short of what the design implied. Staff accommodations were limited and inadequate. The ground floor service areas were functional but basic. Housing for the servants necessary to operate even a minimal household was insufficient. The organization and operation of the household during that first winter was reportedly chaotic, with everyone making do under difficult circumstances. Despite these difficulties, Adams attempted to use the house for official purposes. He received visitors, though entertaining was limited by the unfinished state. The partially completed public rooms could be used when necessary, but formal entertaining on any significant scale wasn't practical. The President's House was technically functioning as a presidential residence, but barely. Adams' presidency ended in March 1801. He had lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson after a contested race decided by the House of Representatives. Adams left Washington quickly after Jefferson's inauguration, departing before dawn on Inauguration Day. He had occupied the president's house for only about 4 months. His time in the building was brief and largely unsatisfactory. The incomplete state of the structure, the difficulties with heating and furnishing, the isolation of the new Capitol, all made the experience challenging. Adams had the distinction of being the first president to occupy the building, but the circumstances denied him the dignified residence the structure was designed to provide. The Adams occupancy established that the building was technically habitable, even if far from comfortable or complete. A president could live there, receive visitors, and conduct official business. The minimum conditions for occupancy had been achieved, even though much work remained. Later presidents would benefit from additional construction and finishing that would gradually complete Hobon's vision. On November 1st, 1800, shortly after moving in, Adams wrote a letter containing words that would become famous. He expressed hope that heaven would bestow blessings on the house and all who would inhabit it, and that only honest and wise men would ever rule under its roof. These words, or a version of them, were later inscribed in the White House, a blessing from the first occupant that has endured across the building's history. Completing the vision, Jefferson's modifications. Thomas Jefferson became the third president and the second to occupy the president's house when he took office in March 1801. Jefferson had strong opinions about architecture. He had submitted his own design in the original competition, though it hadn't been selected. His architectural interests would significantly shape his approach to the still incomplete building. Jefferson found the house in better condition than Adams had encountered, but still far from finished. Interior finishing work that had barely begun during Adams' brief occupancy continued slowly through Jefferson's first term. Workers plastered walls, installed flooring, and completed woodwork throughout the building. The house gradually became more complete and more functional. Jefferson took active personal interest in the building's completion and began making modifications to suit his preferences. His changes would leave lasting marks on the structure, demonstrating that the president's house would continuously evolve under different occupants, rather than remaining static once initially completed. One of Jefferson's most significant contributions was the development of the east and west colonnade wings. Hobon's original design had included some provision for subsidiary structures connected to the main house, but Jefferson expanded and formalized these elements substantially. The colonnades extended from the main building toward east and west, creating covered passages and additional functional space. These colonnades served multiple practical purposes. They provided covered passages connecting the main house to support buildings for storage, stables, and service functions. They created additional protected space for storage and work areas. They also improved the building's visual composition, extending its horizontal reach and connecting the main house more effectively to its grounds. The colonnade design reflected Jefferson's deep interest in classical architecture. The covered walkways with their rows of columns referenced Roman and Palladian precedents that Jefferson had studied extensively. He had traveled in Europe, examined ancient ruins in southern France, and developed strong opinions about architectural forms appropriate for a republic. His additions to the president's house drew on that knowledge. Jefferson also pushed to complete interior spaces that remained unfinished. The East Room finally received plaster and paint during his administration, though it remained sparsely furnished. Other rooms throughout the building were finished and furnished gradually during his 8 years in residence. The house became progressively more complete and more livable. The grounds received attention as well. Jefferson was interested in landscape design and agriculture, maintaining extensive gardens at his Virginia home Monticello. He wanted the president's house to sit in appropriate surroundings rather than amid construction debris and undeveloped land. Trees were planted, paths were laid out, and the grounds gradually began looking designed rather than neglected. Jefferson modified some interior spaces to accommodate his working style and interests. He was particularly interested in natural history, maintaining collections of specimens, fossils, maps, and scientific instruments. Rooms in the president's house were adapted to house these collections and to serve Jefferson's intellectual pursuits. The building became not just a residence, but a workspace reflecting the president's wide-ranging interests. The heating problems that had plagued the Adams family were partly addressed during Jefferson's tenure. Completion of chimney systems that had been unfinished provided more working fireplaces. Improved fireplace construction generated more heat with less wood. The house became gradually more comfortable during winter months, though never truly warm by modern standards. Jefferson's democratic ideals influenced how he used the house and its spaces. He was uncomfortable with excessive ceremony and formality, preferring relatively accessible interactions with citizens. The house's grand scale and formal spaces existed in tension with Jefferson's political philosophy, which emphasized Republican simplicity. He navigated this tension by using the spaces more informally than some later presidents would. Jefferson eliminated some formal protocols that had characterized earlier administrations. He discontinued the formal presidential levees that Washington and Adams had held, where citizens could meet the president in structured ceremonial settings. He preferred smaller, less formal gatherings, and famously received visitors while dressed in worn clothes and bedroom slippers. During Jefferson's presidency, the capital city itself developed gradually. The president's house was no longer an isolated structure in largely undeveloped terrain. Other buildings appeared nearby. Pennsylvania Avenue began developing as an actual street rather than a muddy track. The city that L'Enfant had planned started taking physical form, though progress remained slow. Jefferson left office in 1809 after 2 terms. By then, the president's house was substantially more complete than when Adams first occupied it. Interior spaces were largely finished. The colonnades added architectural interest and functional space. The grounds were beginning to look deliberate rather than random. The building Hoban had designed was much closer to full realization. Jefferson's tenure demonstrated that the president's house would continue evolving. Each president would make modifications driven by changing needs, personal tastes, and contemporary circumstances. Hoban's design provided the basic framework, but the building would never be static or finished in any final sense. It would adapt continuously to the needs of its occupants and the nation they led. The War of 1812. British torch the President's House. On August 24, 1814, British forces entered Washington and systematically burned multiple government buildings, including the President's House. The burning occurred during the War of 1812, a conflict between the United States and Britain that had begun in June 1812, over issues including British interference with American shipping and impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy. The attack on Washington came after several years of warfare that had gone poorly for American forces in many theaters. British troops, freed from European commitments by Napoleon's initial defeat, were available for offensive operations in North America. A British force landed in the Chesapeake Bay region and began moving toward the American capital. President James Madison and his administration received warnings that British forces were approaching. The American military assembled a hastily organized force of regulars and militia to defend Washington. The two forces met at Bladensburg, Maryland, just northeast of the capital, on August 24th. The battle was a disaster for American arms. The American troops, many of them poorly trained militia, broke and fled under British assault. The regulars fought briefly, but were overwhelmed and forced to retreat. The road to Washington lay open. Madison and his cabinet fled the city, along with most of the population who could manage to leave. The capital was essentially defenseless. First, Lady Dolly Madison remained at the president's house longer than her husband, working to save important items before the British arrived. Her actions during those final hours have become legendary, documented in letters she wrote and in accounts from others present. She organized the evacuation of important documents and symbolic items even as the sounds of battle and retreat grew closer. Among the items Dolly Madison saved was the full-length portrait of George Washington, painted by Gilbert Stuart. The painting hung in the state dining room. It was too large to remove easily in the frame, so she reportedly ordered the frame broken and the canvas cut from its stretcher. The painting was carried away and hidden until the emergency passed. That rescued portrait still hangs in the White House today. After Dolly Madison's evacuation, British forces entered the president's house. Contemporary accounts, both British and American, describe what the soldiers found. The house was set for dinner, with food and wine on the table. The hasty evacuation had left a meal prepared, but uneaten. The British officers reportedly consumed the dinner before beginning their destructive work. This detail, whether precisely accurate or embellished in retelling, added to the narrative of violation. The British set fires systematically throughout the building. They used furniture, draperies, and other combustible materials to ensure thorough burning. The wooden interior structure, the floors, the roof framing, all burned intensely. The fires consumed years of finishing work, furniture, and everything combustible within the stone walls. The heat was intense enough to damage the sandstone exterior walls, cracking some stones and discoloring others with smoke and flame. But the walls themselves did not collapse. Stone doesn't burn, though extreme heat can damage it. The exterior walls, that had taken years to construct, remained standing, though blackened and scarred. The shell of the president's house survived, even as the interior was destroyed. The destruction extended to the colonnades Jefferson had built. The wooden elements of these structures burned readily. Some portions collapsed. The service buildings connected to the main house by the colonnades were also destroyed. The damage was thorough and intentional. The British meant to send a message by destroying the symbols of American government. Other government buildings burned the same night. The Capitol building was torched, destroying both the House and Senate chambers, along with the Library of Congress, which was housed there at the time. The Treasury building burned. The War and State Department buildings were destroyed. The systematic targeting of government structures was meant to humiliate the United States and demonstrate British military power. The fires burned through the night, creating a glow visible for miles across the region. Contemporary accounts describe the site of Washington burning, the capital of the young republic, in flames. The psychological impact matched or exceeded the practical damage. The capital city itself had been invaded and deliberately destroyed. Weather reportedly helped limit the destruction. A severe thunderstorm moved through the area on August 25th, producing heavy rain and, according to some accounts, a tornado. The rain helped extinguish fires that might otherwise have burned even more completely. The storm may also have damaged British equipment and camps, contributing to British commanders' decision to withdraw from the capital. The British withdrawal left Washington a damaged, partially burned city. The president's house stood as a ruined shell, its interior destroyed, its walls blackened. The Capitol was similarly devastated. Multiple other structures had been burned or damaged. The capital of the United States had been attacked, and severely damaged by a foreign enemy for the first, and to date, only time. When Madison and other officials returned to Washington after the British withdrawal, they confronted the extent of destruction. The President's house was uninhabitable. The Madisons took up residence at the Octagon House, a private residence loaned for presidential use, and later moved to other temporary quarters. The President had no official residence. The immediate question was whether to rebuild in Washington or relocate the capital elsewhere. The damage was extensive. The capital's location remained inconvenient and, obviously, vulnerable. Some voices urged moving the capital to an established city like Philadelphia, where adequate facilities already existed. The debate was serious, and the outcome uncertain for a time. The decision to rebuild in Washington was significant. It represented determination that the capital would remain where it had been established despite the British attack. Abandoning Washington would have seemed like admitting defeat, allowing the enemy to achieve through fire what they couldn't achieve through force of arms alone. Rebuilding would demonstrate American resilience. The burned President's house stood as a ruin for months, while decisions were made and resources gathered. The structure was unstable in some areas. Assessment was needed to determine what could be salvaged. The reconstruction that would follow would essentially rebuild the interior from scratch while preserving and repairing the damaged exterior walls. Rising from the ashes, Hoban returns to rebuild. Reconstruction of the President's house began in earnest in 1815. James Hoban, the original architect who had designed the building and supervised its initial construction, returned to direct the rebuilding. Now in his late 50s, Hoban had remained in Washington after the building's completion and had continued working as an architect in the developing capital. The first step was assessing the damage and determining what could be salvaged. The exterior sandstone walls had survived, but they were smoke damaged and heat cracked in many places. Careful examination was needed to identify which portions were structurally sound and could be reused. Some stones required replacement. Others could be cleaned and repaired. The foundation had survived intact, providing a solid base for reconstruction. The interior had been completely destroyed. Every wooden element was gone. Floors, partitions, stairs, roof structure, all had burned. The interior would be rebuilt from the foundation up, recreating spaces that had been destroyed. This provided opportunity to make improvements based on experience with the original building, but the basic design would follow Hoban's original plans. Congress appropriated funds for reconstruction in stages. Initial appropriations covered emergency stabilization, planning, and beginning work. Additional appropriations followed as reconstruction progressed and costs became clearer. The total expense was substantial, though less than building entirely new would have cost, since the exterior walls could be reused. The workforce for reconstruction included some who had worked on the original building and new workers recruited for the project. The same construction challenges that had faced the original building reappeared. Materials had to be sourced and transported. Skilled and unskilled labor had to be organized and coordinated. Work proceeded through the same challenging climate that had affected original construction. Stone for repairs came again from the Aquia Creek quarries. Replacement blocks needed to match existing stone in color, texture, and dimensions, so repairs would blend with the original fabric. Careful selection at the quarry was essential. Stonemasons shaped replacement blocks to match the original work's character, fitting new stone into gaps left by removing damaged pieces. The interior reconstruction proceeded floor by floor. Timber framing was rebuilt following the original design, but incorporating improvements where possible. Better construction techniques had developed or become more available since the original building. The framing rose progressively, each floor providing a platform for work on the level above. Plastering interior walls came after the framing was complete. The plasterwork recreated original finishes, including decorative elements in the principal rooms. Skilled plasterers worked on elaborate ceiling designs and the moldings that gave formal rooms their architectural character. This work was time-consuming, requiring proper drying between coats and controlled conditions for curing. The colonnades Jefferson had added were reconstructed along with the main building. The covered passages connecting the house to service buildings were rebuilt, restoring the extended composition Jefferson had created. The service buildings themselves were reconstructed or repaired as needed to provide functional support for the residents. Some modifications were incorporated during reconstruction. Hoban made improvements based on problems identified during the building's first 2 decades of use. These changes were generally refinements rather than fundamental alterations. The goal was restoring the building to its intended function while correcting issues that had emerged during actual occupation. The reconstruction progressed through 1815, 1816, and into 1817. Work proceeded steadily, with Hoban supervising to ensure quality met proper standards. Rushing would risk poor workmanship and future problems. The careful approach extended the timeline but produced durable results. By late 1817, the President's house was sufficiently complete for occupancy. President James Monroe and his family moved into the rebuilt structure. The house was functional, though finishing work continued for some time afterward. The basic reconstruction had taken approximately 3 years from beginning to occupancy. This was substantially faster than the original construction, which had taken 8 years from groundbreaking to first occupancy and remained incomplete even then. The difference reflected several factors. The existing exterior walls provided the structural framework. Experience from the original construction informed the rebuilding process. Perhaps most importantly, there was political will and funding commitment to complete the work expeditiously. The rebuilt President's House was fundamentally the same building Hoban had originally designed. The form, proportions, and character followed the original conception. But it was also new construction in most respects. The interior had been entirely rebuilt. The stone walls had been repaired and restored. The building retained its original character while being substantially reconstructed. The successful reconstruction demonstrated American determination and capability. The British attack had damaged but not destroyed the capital. The willingness to rebuild showed that Washington would remain the seat of government. The restored building symbolized national resilience and commitment to the capital that Washington and L'Alfort had envisioned. Why white? The paint and the name. The President's house had been constructed of Aquia Creek sandstone, which had a natural tan or light brown color when first quarried. The exterior walls were this natural stone color when the building was initially completed and occupied. The transformation to the white appearance, now synonymous with the building, occurred during and after the reconstruction following the 1814 burning. The fire had left the exterior walls severely damaged, though still standing. The sandstone was smoke-stained and discolored. Some areas showed heat damage where the intense interior fires had cracked or altered the stone surface. The walls, while structurally sound enough to reuse, were aesthetically scarred. Simply leaving the walls as they were would mean living with visible reminders of the British attack. The discoloration would mark the building's humiliation. Restoring an attractive appearance required some treatment of the damaged surfaces. Cleaning could address some staining, but the fire damage went deeper than surface dirt. Whitewashing or painting stone buildings was not uncommon in the period. The treatment served several purposes beyond hiding damage. Paint protected stone from weathering by sealing the surface against moisture infiltration. It created a uniform appearance even when individual stones varied in color or showed patching and repairs. It provided a finished look that natural weathered stones sometimes lacked. White paint specifically had both practical and symbolic appeal. White paint was relatively inexpensive and readily available. The lime-based whitewash commonly used was simple to prepare and apply. The bright white color reflected light effectively, making the building appear larger and more impressive. The color suggested cleanliness, freshness, and renewal, appropriate associations for a building rising from fire damage. The decision to paint the president's house white during Reconstruction was thus partly practical, covering fire damage and protecting the stone, and partly symbolic, presenting a renewed appearance to mark recovery from the British attack. The painting occurred during the Reconstruction period of 1815 through 1817. The paint used was lead-based white paint, standard technology for the period. Lead paint was durable and provided excellent coverage and color. Its toxicity was not understood at the time. Lead paint would continue to be used on the building for many decades before its health dangers were recognized and alternatives developed. Maintaining the white appearance required regular repainting. Weather, particularly Washington's humid summers and variable winters, degraded paint surfaces. The building needed repainting every few years to maintain its appearance. This ongoing maintenance became standard practice, creating a cycle of periodic repainting that continues today, though with modern, non-toxic paints. The name White House emerged gradually and was not immediately official. In the early decades after Reconstruction, the building continued to be called the President's House, or the Executive Mansion in official documents and formal contexts. White House appeared as an informal descriptive term in correspondence and newspapers, probably beginning in the 1820s or earlier. The informal name was obviously descriptive. The building was painted white, and it was the President's House. The simplicity and directness of White House made it memorable and easy to use. The name distinguished the building from the Capitol and other government structures. Popular usage spread the term even while official documents maintained more formal nomenclature. For most of the 19th century, multiple names coexisted. Different contexts called for different terms. Official correspondence might use Executive Mansion. Newspaper articles might use White House. Both referred to the same building, and everyone understood both terms. The lack of official standardization allowed informal usage to spread. President Theodore Roosevelt officially adopted White House as the building's name in 1901. He ordered White House printed on executive stationery, replacing Executive Mansion. This presidential determination made White House the official name after decades of informal usage. The formalization came more than 80 years after the building was first painted white. The transformation to white was thus both physical and nominal. The building was painted white during Reconstruction to cover fire damage and present a renewed appearance. The informal name, White House, emerged from this physical characteristic. Official adoption of the name came much later, formalizing what popular usage had long established. The white color has been maintained continuously since the 1815 Reconstruction. Every president since Monroe has occupied a white building. The color has become so identified with the structure that the White House now serves as metonymy, the name representing not just the building, but the presidency and executive branch generally. Expanding and modernizing. 19th century changes. After the Reconstruction of 1815 through 1817, the White House continued evolving through the 19th century. Various presidents made modifications, added technological improvements, and adapted the building to changing needs. The structure Hoban designed and rebuilt remained recognizable, but ongoing changes gradually transformed how it functioned and appeared. The north and south porticos, among the most recognizable features of the White House today, were completed during the 1820s. These columned porches had been part of Hoban's original design, but weren't constructed during the initial building or immediate reconstruction. Adding them completed the building's exterior as originally envisioned. The south portico, facing the grounds behind the building, was completed in 1824 during James Monroe's presidency. The semicircular porch with its tall columns created a distinctive facade on the garden side. The covered space provided sheltered outdoor access to the main floor rooms. The columns and curved form became defining features of the building's appearance. The north portico, facing Pennsylvania Avenue, was completed in 1829 during Andrew Jackson's presidency. This portico created a more imposing entrance sequence, with visitors approaching through the columned porch rather than directly to the building's facade. The addition gave the north front the monumental entrance appropriate for the nation's most important residents. Interior modifications occurred continuously throughout the century, as different presidents adapted spaces to their needs. Rooms were redecorated, furniture was changed, and room uses were modified. The interior flexibility Hoban's design provided allowed these adaptations without major structural changes. Presidents could reshape their living and working spaces within the basic framework. Technological improvements transformed how the building functioned. Running water was gradually installed, replacing or supplementing the original systems of wells and cisterns. Indoor plumbing and water closets improved sanitation and convenience substantially. These improvements occurred in stages across several decades as technology developed and was adapted to the building's specific needs. Gas lighting was installed in the 1840s, replacing candles and oil lamps as primary lighting sources. The gas system required substantial infrastructure. Pipes ran throughout the building. Fixtures were installed in rooms. Connections to the city's gas supply had to be established. The improvement provided brighter, more reliable lighting, particularly important for evening events and winter months. Electric lighting arrived in the 1890s during Benjamin Harrison's presidency. The White House was among the early major buildings to receive electricity. The installation of wiring and fixtures was gradual and initially supplemented rather than replaced gas lighting. The Harrison family was reportedly nervous about the new technology, sometimes leaving lights burning all night rather than touching the switches. Heating systems improved substantially across the century. The original fireplace heating, which had proven inadequate from the Adams family's first winter, was supplemented and eventually partly replaced by central heating systems. These improvements required mechanical equipment, typically in basement spaces, and distribution systems throughout the building. The grounds around the White House developed considerably during the 19th century. The informal landscape of the early years gave way to deliberate design. Gardens were planned and planted. Lawns were cultivated. Trees were positioned for both aesthetic effect and practical shade. Various first ladies took particular interest in the grounds, commissioning improvements reflecting their tastes. Security evolved as the century progressed. The White House initially was remarkably accessible, with public areas open to visitors with minimal restriction. Citizens could walk into the building and, in theory at least, seek audience with the president. This accessibility reflected democratic ideals, but created practical problems and potential dangers. Presidential assassinations heightened security concerns. Lincoln was killed in 1865, though not at the White House. Garfield was shot in 1881. Each tragedy prompted reconsideration of presidential security. Gates, fences, and guards were added or modified. Access to the grounds and building became more controlled, though the White House remained relatively accessible by modern standards. The expansion of federal government and the presidency's growing administrative requirements created pressure for office space. The White House was designed primarily as a residence, not an office building. But presidents needed space to work, and their growing staffs needed accommodations. Interior rooms were increasingly devoted to office use, squeezing the residential functions into smaller areas. By the late 1800s, the White House showed the effects of continuous occupation and accumulated modifications. The building needed comprehensive attention. The structure, rebuilt after 1814, had been in constant use for over 80 years. Systems were aging. Some modifications had created problems. A major renovation would be necessary in the coming century to address accumulating structural and functional issues. Acknowledgement and legacy. Remembering the builders. For most of American history, the contribution of enslaved workers to building the White House received little formal recognition. The historical narrative focused on presidents who occupied the building, architects who designed it, and the symbolic role it played in American government. The laborers, particularly the enslaved laborers, remained largely unnamed and unacknowledged in public memory. This began changing in the late 20th century as historians paid increasing attention to slavery's role in building Washington and the nation's early infrastructure. Research into construction records, payroll ledgers, and other archival documents revealed the extent to which enslaved labor contributed to federal construction projects, including the President's House. The work of documenting enslaved workers' contributions has been painstaking and ongoing. Many historical records didn't name enslaved individuals, identifying them only by count or as property of named owners. Recovering individual names and stories requires cross-referencing various documents, following paper trails through multiple archives, and carefully reconstructing what happened over 2 centuries ago. The White House Historical Association has been particularly active in this research. The organization has sponsored scholarly work examining construction records and supporting efforts to identify enslaved workers by name wherever possible. The goal has been to move beyond general acknowledgement of slavery's role to documenting specific individuals and their contributions. Some names have been recovered through this careful work. Peter, Ben, Daniel, Harry, and others have been identified as enslaved people who worked on the President's House. Some can be connected to specific tasks or time periods. Each recovered name represents an individual whose identity had been lost, but has been partially restored through historical detective work. These recovered names represent only a fraction of the enslaved workers who contributed to construction. Many individuals remain anonymous, their names not recorded in surviving documents or recorded in records that have been lost. The incomplete documentation that enslaved people received in their own time limits what modern researchers can recover. In recent decades, the White House itself has incorporated this history into educational programs and public communications. Tours now discuss the building's construction and acknowledge that enslaved workers were part of the workforce. Educational materials available through official channels address the topic directly, presenting the complex history without minimizing slavery's role. Physical recognition has been added as well. In 2016, First Lady Michelle Obama spoke about enslaved workers who built the White House during a speech at the Democratic National Convention, bringing the topic to wide public attention. Historical markers and educational displays acknowledge the contributions of enslaved laborers, providing tangible recognition at the site where the labor occurred. The effort to acknowledge enslaved workers' contributions represents broader reckoning with slavery's role in American history. The White House presents particular challenges as the nation's most symbolic residence. Acknowledging that enslaved people helped build it requires confronting uncomfortable contradictions at the height of the American founding. The building was meant to house presidents of a nation founded on principles of liberty and equality. The Declaration of Independence, signed 16 years before construction began, declared that all men are created equal. Yet enslaved people, denied liberty and treated as property rather than citizens, built portions of the house where those principles would be administered. This contradiction was not unique to the White House. Federal buildings throughout Washington were built with enslaved labor. The Capitol building employed enslaved workers in its construction. Much of the early republic's infrastructure was built by people who did not share in the freedoms the nation proclaimed. Modern acknowledgement cannot change historical injustice. The enslaved people who helped build the White House cannot be compensated or given back years lived in bondage. But acknowledgement can ensure that history is not forgotten or minimized. The workers who contributed essential labor deserve to be remembered as part of the building's complete history. The legacy of the White House's construction is thus complex. The building represents American democracy and presidential tradition. It also represents the compromises with slavery that characterized the nation's founding. Both aspects are historically true. Understanding the full history requires acknowledging both, neither emphasizing one at the expense of the other. The White House will continue evolving as it has for over 2 centuries. Future occupants will make modifications. Technology will advance. The building will adapt while maintaining connection to its origins. The ongoing research into who built it and under what circumstances will continue enriching understanding of this most American of buildings. Conclusion. The White House stands today as one of the world's most recognized buildings. The neoclassical facade, the white columns, the carefully maintained grounds create an image of stability, tradition, and democratic governance. Over 200 years of history have shaped both the building and its meaning. But the White House's story begins not with presidents or ceremonies, but with construction. The building rose from challenging ground along the Potomac through years of difficult labor. The timeline from cornerstone to first occupancy stretched 8 years. The work was demanding, dangerous, and difficult. The building represents thousands of hours of human effort under challenging circumstances. That effort came from diverse sources. Free craftsmen brought skills learned through apprenticeship in America and Europe. Immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, and England sought opportunity in the growing capital. Enslaved workers, compelled without choice or compensation, provided essential labor. All contributed to raising the structure. The building exists because of their collective work. James Hobun's design provided the framework. His Georgian architecture, adapted from Irish and British precedents, gave the building its character. The classical proportions, the symmetry, the restrained ornament all established patterns that would influence American government architecture for generations. Hobun supervised construction of his design and returned to rebuild it after the British burning. The survival of the 1814 attack and subsequent reconstruction demonstrated resilience. The decision to rebuild rather than relocate the Capitol was significant. The restored building, painted white to cover fire damage, emerged from destruction to become the structure recognized today. The burning and reconstruction are as much part of the story as original construction. The White House has evolved continuously since completion. Porticos added architectural character. Technological improvements transformed function. Interior modifications adapted spaces to changing needs. Each era has left its mark while respecting the original framework. The building is never truly finished, always adapting. Understanding the White House requires acknowledging complexity and contradiction. The building represents democratic ideals and presidential tradition. It was also built partly through enslaved labor, creating tension between symbol and historical reality. Both aspects are true. Complete history embraces complexity rather than avoiding it. The ongoing efforts to acknowledge all who built the White House represent progress toward fuller historical understanding. Research continues recovering names and documenting contributions. This work serves accuracy and honors those whose labor was essential, but long unrecognized. The complete story includes everyone who built the building. The White House connects present to past tangibly. The walls standing today include stones quarried and shaped in the 1790s. The rooms where current presidents work are the same spaces Hoban designed. The building provides physical continuity across American history, a structure that has witnessed and housed over 200 years of presidential governance. The building's most important legacy may be its demonstration that significant public structures can endure across centuries while remaining functional and relevant. The President's House, built between 1792 and 1800, rebuilt after 1814, modified continuously since, still serves its original purpose. This longevity speaks to the quality of design and construction, and to the ongoing commitment to maintain and adapt the structure. If you found this exploration of the White House's construction and history valuable, please consider subscribing for more documentaries about architectural and historical subjects. Thank you for watching.